The Absolute, or simply TA, comes equipped with 4 modes: Normal, Master, Versus, and a secret 4th thing. Normal is intended as a shorter, easier mode to help make the game more beginner-friendly. The level only goes up to 300, and you get a few items to help you out, but other than that there isn't much to it. Then you have Versus, which is similar to TGM1, as well as the secret Doubles mode, where 2 players have to reach level 300 on the same board. Mihara claimed this to have been inspired by the Doubles mode from Semi-Pro, although that was itself likely inspired by Sega's doomed Tetris for the Mega Drive, which was itself likely inspired by Atari's doomed Tetris for the NES. Good to know it finally made its way into an official game that actually released. Master is the meat of the game. It's similar to TGM1, but with some key differences. Moving the joystick up now performs a sonic drop, similar to a hard drop except it doesn't instantly lock unless you flick the joystick back down. This is great for performing fast tucks, and it also just makes the game generally faster for high-level players. It also means you don't have to be building your stack super high in order to minimize soft dropping time, making the early levels generally safer when going for speed. This feature was actually first developed for TGM1, although it was eventually cut as the development team wasn't sure if it was good for the game. But Mihara had grown confident enough in players' abilities to add it to TA. The grading system has also been changed. Your score no longer matters for your grade. Instead, grades are now based on an opaque and somewhat complicated system with internal points and decay and whatnot. Basically, all you need to do to improve your grade is play faster, survive longer, and get lots of Tetrises. Another addition you may have noticed is a group of medals. They come in 6 types, each with 3 delicious flavors, and function as achievements for each game, with varying levels of importance. AC is for performing bravos, RO is for rotating the pieces a lot, ST is for approaching or beating the section time records on your cabinet, SK is for getting Tetrises, RE is for performing recoveries by having a high playfield and then digging it back down, and CO is for performing combos. As mentioned earlier, Master is faster. The levels up to 500 are the same, but the 20G now gets faster as you progress, with less time before the piece locks and before the next piece spawns. This speed increase is relatively gradual, up until 900 where it jumps fast enough to give you a heart attack. Finally, the soundtrack is once again fantastic. Ipe Papi hears that TA has arrived at an arcade in Ofuna a week early. It is raining. He slips. I've told this story before. After the previous night's debacle, Ipe Papi visited the hospital and the optician to get his glasses fixed. Then it was straight back to the arcade, this time with Kuroda. After a few games that ended on S8, he found that his S9 game turned into an M at $9.99. If M was similar to the last game's GM, what were the conditions for achieving it? And did TA have a GM grade? There was a lot to discover. The community was finding that some people were clearing with S9s and some people were clearing with Ms. It appeared that the main requirement was reaching $9.99 in under 9.5 minutes, although there were likely other requirements as well. Mihara confirmed in an interview that M was roughly equivalent to GM from the first game, although somewhat harder due to the speed increase. However, he refused to reveal whether there were any further grades. Unsurprisingly, Nov now had a solid lead for fastest M with an 8.13. Also unsurprisingly, the community was planning another tournament to celebrate TA's release. Tournaments are easy in a country like Japan. It's probably about time to talk about the credit rolls. Once you reach $9.99, you'll receive one of 2 types of credit rolls based on whether you achieved M or not. The non-M roll is a 60-second survival challenge with the added feature that the pieces turn invisible a few seconds after locking. Beating this challenge rewards you with an orange line under your score on the leaderboard. The M roll is far more difficult. In this roll, the pieces disappear the moment they lock. This is commonly called Invisible Tetris, and this roll was way too difficult for anyone to beat at the time. Surviving it requires memorizing the shape of your stack at speed, something that none of the players had experience with. So there was debate as to whether the reward for beating the M roll would be a new grade or simply an orange line M. As the evening rolled around, Ipe Papi got a call from Kuroda to head to their local arcade as soon as possible. He arrived to find a group of people huddled around one of the TA machines, which now carried the word plus. This mysterious new version came with two brand new modes. The first was TGM Plus. It seemed to be a side mode similar to TGM1 but with rising garbage reminiscent of Block Seed. The other mode was far more interesting. It was called TAEX and it started at 20G. Not just that, but it was really fast. It started similar in speed to Master's level 700, and by 300 it was similar to Master's 900, and it only got more hardcore from there. By 400 it's so fast that when you make a mistake, by the time you've registered it, 2 or 3 more pieces have already dropped, which have likely ruined your stack. In other words, it was a gift to TA's most hardcore players. Ipe Papi managed to make it to 499, and nobody else made it far enough to see how fast 500 was. Another location test for TA+. TAEX was now called TA Death. This time, Ipe Papi just barely managed to make it to level 500, at which point the credit roll played. It appeared Mihara had been merciful in ending it there. Tetris the Absolute the Grandmaster 2 Plus, or simply TAP, released to Japanese arcades as a free upgrade for TA. There were a few notable changes. The requirements for M were considerably more difficult, doubles mode was now available in the menu, and of course TGM Plus and Death. A few of the top players were now reaching the credits at 500. That was, until Nov tried it. It turns out, if you reach level 500 fast enough, the game continues, and you're rewarded with Death's own M rank. So the race was on to see who would be the first to reach the true end of Death. The day after TAP's official release, Nov's Death PB was 561. His stacking up to 500 was often very clean, but 500 was another speed increase again, meaning even he was falling apart quickly. On the 28th, he made it to 591, then to 613 the next day. New Year's Day saw him jump to 689, and his confidence was boosted once he realized that 600 didn't come with a speed increase. As per usual, nobody was improving as fast as he was. On the 7th of January, Zon became the second player to break the 500 barrier with a 577, but by this point Nov's PB was over 800. But don't get the idea that this was effortless. Nov had become obsessed with Death to the point where he wasn't playing any of the other modes, which gave Zon and later 3-7 the opportunity to take the time record for Master M. By the end of January, 3 more players had achieved Death M, Ipe Papi and 2 players named Bomi and MB. MB, not to be confused with MT, was a player from Narashino whose TGM1 PB was around 920 at the time, an incredibly good time that I unfortunately missed earlier due to the lack of archived records, and he was now honing his skills on both Death and Master. Also at the end of January, a new movie was uploaded to Eureka's website. This was not a new thing, in fact this was the 4th TA related movie they had posted. There was previously a sample video of TA and demonstrations of TexMaster M and doubles, but this time the video was for Death. As it turned out, Nov had been invited to Eureka's office to record himself playing Death for use as a promotional video, and although the quality is a bit crap, this is the oldest surviving footage of a TA Death run, which means we can analyze it. Nov's stacking remains clean all throughout the first 500 levels. You can see him act with both speed and careful consideration, slowing down when he needs to for the more complicated moves. Despite some risky moments coming into 500, he manages to clean up and stay clean up until a brutal infamous drop at 660. He falls apart quickly from there, effectively losing the whole bottom half of the board. So he switches to survival mode in the 700s, slowly creeping closer to the top until the video fades after 800. The proper ending of the run was eventually released in 2002, showing that he topped out at 812. This was easily the most impressive feat of Tetris skill ever captured on video at the time. Not only was it the gold standard for studying death, it was also just astounding to watch, especially if you were only aware of Tetris as that casual game for non-gamers. Arika definitely did not anticipate just how viral this video was about to become.
You know, the internet started out with people doing research, sending email, looking for information sites. That is all changing. The internet is becoming an important medium for distributing pure entertainment.
The internet was the largest it had ever been, and the video quickly escaped the bounds of the Japanese community and was being shared worldwide via forums, emails, word of mouth, and early content sharing websites such as eBaum's World, although by the time it had spread to the Western world, its name had been changed from the unpalatable Death 800 to the catchy but somewhat misleading Tetris Japan Finals. This game of internet telephone meant that few, if any, of the awestruck Western viewers were aware that the original download page was full of serious sounding threats not to repost the video, but Arika seemed to have no plans to take any real action against the unstoppable wave of reposts. Beyond just the state of the internet, this video had the perfect recipe to go viral. Tetris was one of the most famous games of all time. It was a household name, but outside of Japan, the games were made pretty much exclusively for casual players and children, so in the event that someone did want to get good at Tetris, their options were lacking. On the arcade side, you had Atari's 1988 Tetris, which wasn't very difficult, or Tetris Plus, which mainly focused around solving puzzles and received a lukewarm reception outside Japan. Nintendo's NES Tetris still had a few fans, and the faster speeds were quite difficult, but much of that difficulty came from the fiddly controls and brutal random pieces, not the speed. Simply put, Western Tetris had been in an entirely different world from Japan ever since the release of Sega's version, which had been forging high-level players for well over a decade. And of course, TGM was a completely unknown series outside of Japan. This was many people's first time seeing such a game, or even realizing that Tetris could be played with such skill. You probably won't be surprised to hear that Tetris Japan Finals heavily reinforced the hardcore Asian gamer stereotype, with download links frequently accompanied by quips like, "You may think you're good at Tetris, but wait until you see a Japanese level Tetris player." The video did also inspire some people to want to start playing high level Tetris. However, the few people who did look into the game helpfully named on screen quickly learned that the series was only released to Japanese arcades. There was some luck. The Impact emulator had been able to play TGM1 for over a year, albeit with some issues as the emulator was primarily developed for the ZN2's fighting game repertoire. By 2002, Impact had been superseded by the more stable Zinc emulator, and by this point a variety of curious people had begun putting various amounts of time into TGM1, effectively becoming the first genuine players outside of Japan. For the moment, however, these were just isolated people who hadn't yet formed any sort of community. In addition, despite the fact that TAP's underlying hardware was already compatible with the popular MAME emulator, the ROM for the game hadn't yet been dumped, likely due to fears of repercussions from Arika, meaning it wasn't possible to play. We'll have to check up later. Nov continued playing Death after the promotional video went out, and less than a week later he announced that he had reached level 999 and achieved GM. Not only was this incredibly impressive, as no other player had even reached 700 yet, but it also implied that Master likely had a GM grade as well. So the question arose, if there was a GM, did it simply require stacking cleaner and faster, or was it behind the M roll? Nov was taking an extended break after his Death GM, so a new race had begun to achieve the first Master GM, if it even existed. The time record for M would trade hands a few times over the next few few months, with Nov briefly returning to pull off a 7:48 before disappearing again. By October, Ipepapi had brought the record under 7:45, over a minute faster than the M requirement, but he still hadn't seen any differences, and still nobody had beaten the M roll. It may seem surprising how much trouble the M roll was giving people compared to the fading roll, but not only is Invisible Tetris incredibly difficult, it's also an entirely different skill from the rest of TGM. And again, the skill doesn't just carry over. This means that the first person to beat the roll wouldn't necessarily be the fastest player overall, it'd be whichever M level player was the best at Invisible. On December 2nd, the time record was taken by a player named Jin. No, not that Jin. This was another player also named Jin. It's confusing, I know. So confusing that I accidentally introduced the wrong Jin in the player profiles. This other Jin hadn't been active in the community for as long, but his rate of improvement was impressive, so he had soon surpassed the other Jin in skill. To differentiate himself, he started going by Jin 8, although I have yet to locate Jins 2 through 7. 6 days later, on December 8th, 2001, a player announces that they have beaten the M roll and achieved the rank of GM. In the end, it wasn't achieved by any of the players we've met previously. It was achieved by a lesser known player by the name of HRB, although the achievement catapulted him to overnight fame. HRB had the advantage that he had bought a tap arcade board in November, so he could play at home as often as he wanted, which was daily. However, there was one point of interest about the GM. It was a green line, and Mihara was hinting that there may be something beyond the green line GM. But Mihara says a lot of things. He had been claiming various levels of undiscovered grades since the game came out, either to create mystery or just to mess with people. Either way, after the first GM, things began to quieten down again as nobody else could seem to beat the M roll yet. So why not take a break with another tournament? This one was called the Death Festival, and it was intended both as a competition and a chance for players to practice their death skills. HRB turned up, as well as many others. The quarterfinalists were MB and Jin, while the finals ended up being between Zon and a player named Key, who you may have caught earlier. Zon won the tournament, and he also took the opportunity to record for another promotional video, this time a pretty fast Death GM with even fewer pixels. But things weren't so bad for Key, who would go on to take the Death GM time record shortly afterwards. Fun fact, MB's Death World record in January was less than a month after MT's 9:13, and at the same time as both of these, the Doubles World record was held by a player named MO, not to mention that one of the fastest Master players at the time was named MW. What are they, the Polgar sisters of Tetris? Meanwhile, Nov, having apparently grown bored of being at the top for so long, seemed to be permanently retired from TGM at this point. It's now June 2002. MB has taken back the death record from Key, having pulled off the first sub 540 just a week prior. However, Grandmaster HRB is now on the running to take it from him, being on his own 540 pace run coming into 900. He tops out, just a few pieces short of what would have been a huge PB and mere seconds behind the world record. Coincidentally, also gunning for the record at the exact same time as MT, who is currently also on a 540 pace run coming into 900. And the exact same thing happens to him as well. The two share their sorrow, and HRB returns to practicing Master. At this point, he's now one of 3 Master GMs, along with 2 players named Toshyang and DDS, although HRB was still comfortably the fastest. DDS was also one of the participants in the Death Festival, although he lost to MB. 4 days later, on the 17th, HRB pulls off an astounding 5:31, improving his PB by a full 20 seconds and finally taking the record for Death. Later that day, out of nowhere, Kuroda appears, claiming that he has achieved an Orange Line GM, although it wasn't clear what the exact requirements were besides doing especially well on the M roll. There was just one issue: it was done on the original TA, where M was a lot easier to achieve. So he switches over to doing attempts on tap, but with fierce competition there's no guarantee he'll be first. HRB pulls off 2 more GMs before the end of the month, but they're both green. Then on July 5th, a player announces that they have achieved the Orange Line GM on tap. It's DDS, just 3 months after he had achieved his first green line. It appeared that achieving the orange line likely required clearing a certain number of lines in the roll, eventually determined to be 32. There was debate over whether or not Mihara had been lying about there being further grades, but there was one player determined to find out. In February 2003, Gen 8 became the 3rd player to achieve Orange Line GM, behind the other 2 skilled invisible players DDS and HRB. But he wasn't satisfied, so he continued practicing, eventually obtaining a 2nd Orange GM in April and then another one later that week. By May, he had managed to beat HRB's time record, bringing it down twice more over the next few months, at which point he stopped keeping track of how often he was getting the orange line. His goal was to be getting an orange GM every day, and he was pretty close. In the span of a year, Gen 8 had grown from a relatively unknown player to one of the best invisible Tetris players on the planet, as well as one of the fastest TGM players overall. Mihara could hint all he wanted about there being new undiscovered grades, but if Gen 8 wasn't finding them, nobody would. It had been nearly 3 years now since TA's original release, but thanks to TAP's longevity, the community was the strongest it had ever been. There were great top players, and there were plenty of new and improving players, so if there was any time to try going for a home console port, it would be now. Mihara wasn't really willing to admit it publicly, but he was desperate for a port of TGM or TAP as much as everyone else, so much so that he had already secretly begun development on a PS2 port of TAP, with no license and without even telling TTC, presumably in the hopes that he would have a shot at getting a license sometime in the future. That wasn't looking likely though. Shortly before TA's release in 2000, Eureka had released another non-TGM Tetris game called Tetris with Cardcaptor Sakura Eternal Heart, and they ended up releasing this game on the PlayStation? How the hell did they manage that? Clamp is an all-female manga artist group, active since around 1987. The dog isn't part of the group. They've produced dozens of works over the past 40 years, most of which were created during the 90s, and many of which are critically acclaimed. In 1999, Clamp began writing a shonen manga named Angelic Lair, following a middle school girl named Misaki who grows infatuated with Angelic Lair, a game which involves creating special dolls and having them battle in the Angelic Lair. She is supported on this journey by a mysterious and eccentric man going by the name Ichan.
Wrong as usual. So, here's your penalty. 10 minutes with a live octopus in your pants.
As the story progresses, it's revealed that Ichan is actually the genius inventor of the Angelic Lair and a longtime friend of Misaki's mother, so he enjoys watching her improve and compete in the various tournaments. Eventually, Ichan's full name is also revealed.
Idiot. Mihara here.
The real Ichiro Mihara was a classmate of one of Clamp's founding members in university and had since grown to be close friends with the group. Thus, they decided to base one of Angelic Lair's characters off of him, both in name and in personality. Fictional Mihara, like the real Mihara, is notoriously eccentric, loud, and immature, with the notable difference that fictional Mihara is a tall and handsome genius.
Yo!
Clamp's 1996 manga Card Captor Sakura also features a supporting character named Chiharu Mihara, whom they later mention was named after Ichiro's real-life daughter. Thanks to Mihara's connection with Clamp, and thanks to their previous addiction to Street Fighter II, a game designed by Akira, Arika got the opportunity to release 2 Card Captor Sakura games for the PS1 in August 1999 and January 2000. Then, shortly after this, they obtained a license from TTC to create a Card Captor Sakura themed Tetris game called Eternal Heart, or simply Etahar as the community called it. So, the biggest question is, how did Arika get a PS1 Tetris license while one platform, one game was in place? It's not certain, but the likely answer is that by 2000 TTC had quietly relaxed their stance on this policy somewhat, and that Etahar was sufficiently unique, or alternatively that they had been selectively using it as an excuse for any game they didn't want to license. The second question is, why did TTC license Etahar but not TGM? The most likely answer to this is that Card Captor Sakura was a massively popular money-printing franchise at the time, and a themed Tetris game was pretty likely to have broad appeal with children and teens. Etahar is nothing like TGM, it's far less difficult and clearly aimed towards the young people the Card Captor franchise itself was directed towards. Yet another PS1 Tetris game had also been licensed around the same time, created by Success Corp as part of their Super Light 1500 series of budget PlayStation games, and this one doesn't even have any unique selling points besides its price. But it was an unexpected hit, boosted massively by a TV appearance featuring famous music producer Hikaru Utada battling against Hitoshi Matsumoto. He still sucks ass, by the way. In 2001, Mihara claimed on his blog that the main reason TGM couldn't get a home console release wasn't one platform, one game, but instead because of the success of Success's budget Tetris, claiming that a TGM game would inevitably be a lot more expensive, and that even if TGM fans say they would buy the better product even if it's more expensive, the general public wasn't likely to buy it, and the wholesalers weren't likely to buy it either. In his words, the TGM series had lost to the 1500 series. To make matters worse, in late 2000 TTC had signed a deal giving exclusive Tetris publishing rights for PS1, PS2, Xbox, Game Boy Advance, GameCube, and PC for at least the next 3 years to an American distribution company named THQ. This likely made releasing a TGM game on any of those platforms completely infeasible. And there was one other factor that was rumored to be having an effect on licensing, and that was a personal conflict between Mihara and Hank. Tetris's ownership structure was somehow more confusing in 2001 than it was in 1989 when Robert Stein pretended to own rights he didn't. This is what I believe happened. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, Alorg, which held the original rights to Tetris, transformed into a private company ran solely by Nikolai Belikov. However, back in '85, Alexei had handed the rights to Alorg specifically for a 10-year period, meaning they reverted to his control in 1995. Hank and Alexei, worried Belikov might drag them through a legal battle to try and claim the rights again, instead struck a deal with him that led to the creation of TTC in 1996. The Tetris rights officially went to Alorg, who now had an equal stake in TTC along with Hank's new company, Blue Planet Software. TTC was jointly run by Hank, Alexei, and Minoru Arakawa, and its job was to license the Tetris trademark to game developers as they saw fit. While this was happening, BPS continued to make new Tetris games, and Belikov was no longer really involved. He was basically retired. Later in 2005, Hank and Alexei would buy out Alorg and replace it with a new company named Tetris Holding. Immediately after THQ acquired Tetris distribution rights, they began working with BPS to create a new game called Tetris Worlds, set to release on nearly every platform THQ owned. The Game Boy version was handled by a company called 3D6 Games. They finished in September. BPS was handling the other 4 platforms, and THQ's goal was to have the game out on PC and PS2 by Christmas. However, shortly after development started, Henk disappeared, only to return months later and demand a complete redesign of the game to better fit his ambitious vision. As a result, only the PC version was completed before the deadline, and it was a shell of what it was supposed to be. The PS2 version was completed a few months later, by which point a furious THQ had offloaded the work for the final two platforms onto another company named Radical Entertainment. The Japanese ports ended up being handled by Success Corp, although whether or not THQ had granted them exclusive rights to Tetris in Japan is unclear. All 5 of the game's versions were met with mostly unfavorable reviews. However, Tetris Worlds wasn't just Henk's vision in terms of the visual design. As it turns out, Worlds was effectively a pilot test for TTC's brand new Tetris Guideline, a strict set of rules for both the design and gameplay intended for all future versions of Tetris. This standardization was done partly because Henk and Alexei were hoping to turn Tetris into an e-sport sometime in the future. Another reason was to make sure the game was as simple and forgiving as possible for casual players, and playable with any type of controls, even on a mobile phone. One of the most notable aspects of the new guideline is the super rotation system, a somewhat complicated system designed so that pieces can usually rotate in any situation. The piece randomizer uses what's known as 7-bag, where each of the 7 pieces are handed out in a random order, followed by another set of 7, and so on. This makes it impossible to get a piece more than twice in a row, or a piece drought longer than 12. The guideline also enforced a hold feature, specific piece colors, and scoring for T-spins, among other things. With the guideline, Henk hoped to bring together what he saw as 2 opposing styles of Tetris, the Western style and the Japanese style. However, the guideline ended up being so controversial that short of standardizing Tetris, TTC had pretty much just invented a third competing style. Most of the guideline's rules are great for casual play, but not so great for the existing high-level players. Memorizing all the different ways a piece can rotate is a much taller order with SRS, where each piece has 5 different kicks depending on the current rotation state, and not all of these kicks are intuitive, leading to unexpected behavior. On the other hand, 7-bag was frequently criticized for making the game too easy. In fact, not only does it make playing extremely consistent, when combined with hold, there actually exist viable strategies to play forever with no chance of topping out. Holding and the focus on T-spins aren't fundamentally bad, they just shift the most effective way to play more towards memorizing T-spin setups, which again requires relearning if you're used to a different system. But the worst offender is the move reset. Under this system, moving a piece at all resets the lock delay, allowing you to simply move or rotate a piece back and forth to stop it from locking and buy yourself time to think. Licensees had the option to choose between a maximum of 15 move resets per piece, or infinity. Infinity, of course, removes any stress the game may have had.
So, in essence, you're saying that they broke Tetris.
They totally broke Tetris,
Tetris
Jeff.
is broken.
Tetris is totally broken.
How do you break Tetris?
If you want to play broken Tetris, play Tetris Worlds.
Henk's reasoning behind adding this was that casual players would appreciate it and advanced players will be going for speed anyway. This of course assumes that every mode is purely about going as fast as possible and that casual players are completely averse to pressure.
That's really all I have to say about Tetris Worlds.
I feel broken now too.
To the surprise of no one, Mihara was not particularly fond of the new Tetris guideline. It was nearly the antithesis of everything TGM stood for. Since day one, Arika had been fighting a constant uphill battle trying to get TTC to give the TGM series a proper chance. Having the series succeed on home consoles would prove that there is a market for more high-level players, something that you'd think Henk and Alexei would want for their Tetris Olympics idea, but TTC wasn't willing to give them a shot, and Mihara felt that the wholesalers probably weren't going to give them a shot either. This, along with the THQ deal, were the 2 main reasons Mihara felt there was no hope for a console game in 2002. There are rumors, there's no evidence of course, but there are rumors players that at the time of Worlds' release, Hank was only willing to license Tetris games that followed the new guideline, that Mihara simply refused to compromise his vision and twist the TGM series to fit it, and that this caused some personal tension with Hank. This was a reasonable conclusion to make at the time. However, there's no reason to believe that Hank had some kind of personal attachment to the guideline simply because he helped design it. That line of thinking mainly followed from stories regarding his overbearing involvement with Worlds, which was mainly just a consequence of his very ambitious ideas. And besides, it turned out that Mihara wasn't completely unwilling to compromise. This is why he had quietly begun working on a PS2 port of TAP around 2003. He was going to try to work with the guideline, or maybe around the guideline. The plan was to give players the option between Classic Rule, which was regular TAP, and World Rule, which was named after and would be closer to Tetris Worlds, with SRS and Move Reset, thus hopefully satisfying both the community and TTC. Also, THQ's exclusivity deal was set to end at the end of 2003, meaning after 3 years Arika would finally have the opportunity to make a pitch for a port of TAP. Better late than never, I suppose. Another thing the public wasn't yet aware of was that sometime around May, Mihara had also entered talks with TTC to release another brand new TGM game, just for arcades at the moment, but possibly for other platforms as well once the THQ deal ended. But unbeknownst to Mihara, an entirely new issue was about to jeopardize his plans. Mihara was about to go to war. In May of 2003, Mihara made a post to his blog regarding the clone game situation, a topic he rarely discussed publicly. He admits that he does like clones with original features, likely referring to GTED, and that the TGM series took inspiration from clones of older games, likely referring to Semi-Pro. But the main purpose of the post was to implore players to exercise restraint regarding the discussion and spread of clones. The community somewhat complied, but there were a lot of different opinions. From this point on, there was near constant debate regarding whether clones were hurting revenue, whether TTC knew about them, and whether or not they were getting in the way of licensing. The complete lack of evidence either way prompted all sorts of wild speculation, which continued up until early September, when Mihara officially announced in a magazine interview that Tetris the Grandmaster 3 was in development. Here's the important information. The game was being developed for the Sega Naomi arcade system, and it was set to release around spring 2004. However, this system used very similar architecture to the Dreamcast, and furthermore, this interview was published in Dorimaga, formerly Dreamcast magazine, although it had since grown into a more general gaming magazine. Either way, much of the community reasonably concluded that the game was also planned for a Dreamcast release, and possibly other consoles as well. This would make TGM3 one of the last games ever developed for the Dreamcast, a console nearly 5 years old, but you take what you can get. Mihara admitted that he originally didn't think he could improve upon TAP, but TGM3 gave Arika the opportunity to experiment with a card system that would allow players to carry their data between machines by carrying around a physical card. And besides, the Guideline's mandatory hold feature in 3 next pieces did theoretically raise the skill ceiling. As with the still unannounced TAP port, the game would let players choose between the Classic and World rules, although most players admitted they only planned to play on Classic and hoped that this would convince TTC of its value. But the most important note from this interview was that Arika still didn't actually have a license. They were still in talks with TTC. In fact, according to Mihara, development on TGM3 had already been halted and then restarted once before due to the unwanted spread of a clone. Not clones in general, a clone, singular. So let's take a look at what options were available to home TGM players at the time, and narrow down which one was likely causing Arika so much trouble. GTET's website remained operational up until August of 2000, at which point TTC informed Eureka that they needed to contact the game's creator and get them to cease distribution, and that this was a requirement for TA to release. Gu promptly removed the download link when he got the email from Eureka, and he rebranded the site to a general TGM information page. The fact that this demand came right before TA's release means one of two things. Either TTC already knew about GTET but didn't feel the need to take action until the new release, or they specifically went searching for TGM clones after licensing TA. But something about this doesn't add up. TTC was sending legal threats to tiny fan games with like a dozen downloads in the 90s. There's no way they didn't already know about GTET, a comparatively widespread game. And why did they make Eureka take it down instead of handling it themselves? The truth is that TTC was never as harsh against Tetris fan games in Japan, although the exact reason is unclear to me. Maybe differences with Japan's legal system? TTC didn't want GTET taken down because it was a Tetris fan game, or even because it was a TGM fan game, but instead because it was a direct copy of TGM1. So, a game simply inspired by TGM might be safe from the panopticon. Let's put that theory to the test. Back in April of '99, a programmer by the name of Kenji Hoshimoto, better known by the alias Hoshiken, released his own Sega-inspired Tetris fan game for the FM Towns computer, which he called Heberus. Around the same time, he began playing TGM on and off, although he didn't fully understand the philosophy behind it until the release of TA and TAP. As the rate he played increased, so too did his desire to play a TGM-style game at home, eventually culminating in a remake of Heberus for Windows, named Heberus 2001. TAP's influence on the new Heberus is far from subtle, with 4 modes roughly equivalent to Normal, Master, Master starting in 20G, and Death, and of course an additional Versus mode. The game also benefits from a polished visual style, a rare sight for freeware Tetris in 2001. But Hoshiken wasn't trying to create a clone of TAP, but instead just a fun and polished Tetris fan game that he could share online. In fact, he deliberately avoided copying TGM's timings and mechanics so as to not mess with players' muscle memory. Hoshiken was only expecting a couple dozen people to download the game. However, unlike GTET's glacial spread, Heberus exploded in popularity upon release, spreading all across free game download sites and bringing in thousands of people who had never played or even heard of the TGM series before. This popularity was boosted by the inclusion of a replay system where players could share replay files of their runs, and by an online leaderboard run by Hoshiken. Also, it was just one of the most polished freeware versions of Tetris available. So, was Heberus safe from TTC? It appeared so. Hoshiken wasn't getting any legal threats or takedown requests from Eureka, and as with GTET, Mihara seemed to enjoy its originality, so it seemed all good. That was until late 2002, when Hoshiken discovered that a 2chan thread had been started named Just Play Heberus for now. Unsurprisingly, Heberus had grown to become quite a popular option for TGM players looking to play at home, and a lot of them were disappointed about the differences between Heberus and TGM. They also realized that the game was incredibly easy to modify, and thus various thread members had begun developing mods in order to make it closer to TGM and TAP, as well as various quality of life improvements. This modified version was originally called Hebo Remix, although years later it would come to be named Heberus Unofficial Expansion, or simply UE. Many of the 2chan thread members were critical of Hoshiken, especially regarding some poorly received jokes present in the original code, so he mostly avoided reading the thread, thus remaining unaware of the direction Hebo Remix was taking in 2003. Still, like Gu, Hoshiken was completely willing to take down Heberus if he was ever asked to by Eureka or TTC, except no request was coming. This was likely because the original Heberus wasn't a direct TGM clone, and the mods that were developed by multiple, mostly anonymous people, making it difficult to target any specific person. Besides, Hebo Remix still wasn't very widespread. In fact, the first time Hoshiken heard there might be an issue was when the Dorimaga interview went out in September, containing the vague mention of TGM3's halted development. He feared that this may have been related to Heberus, but if it was, he likely would have heard something by now, so the issue may have been elsewhere. Starting around 2000, a Tetris player by the name of Mihis would spend the next 3 years working on what he considered to be the ideal Tetris fan game, mainly to remedy the fact that there were no home Tetris games that enabled fast, high-level play. Mihis hadn't actually played TGM all that much, although he was drawn towards death when it came out. His game was mainly inspired by various other versions of Tetris, with the additional focus on playing as fast as possible. However, the end result was a game that happened to play similarly to TGM, and was thus quite popular with the TGM community. This game was called D-Tet, and it demanded an even higher level of skill than TAP did when it released in early 2003. Mihis was one of the first high-level Tetris players to understand the importance of having multiple next pieces for fast play, and as such, D-Tet comes with 25 next pieces as standard. The game also comes with brain-melting visuals and music, which is an interesting choice. Mihis also never received any emails from Arika, although he would voluntarily remove the download link in 2005 after hearing about TTC's treatment of other fan-made Tetris games, but he was kind enough to continue updating the leaderboard, which he still does to this day. Mihis was one of, if not the fastest Tetris player in the early 2000s. The dude was way ahead of his time. He probably could have set some TGM world records if he bothered to actually play it. To date, he remains the only person in history to not like TAP because it was too slow. Although not exactly a clone, there was reason to assume that emulated versions of TGM might be cause for concern. However, Zinc was still the only emulator that could play TGM, and Tapster wasn't available on any emulator. On top of this, most of the community preferred to play the existing clone games, and the number of active players outside Japan was still a single digit. Further evidence towards this not having been the issue is that shortly after the Dorimaga interview, the TGM ROM was also added to MAME, although it didn't actually work until June 2004. Arika knew about this for sure, but they weren't taking action against either of the emulators, which they easily could have, so that rules out Zinc. Wait, is that everything? I mean, besides some of the Heberus mods, none of these really fit the bill. What are we missing? Right, here's where things get tricky. Akihiko Suehiro, also known by his player name Aki, was a master's student and longtime TGM player in Fukui who was consistently achieving Master M by late 2002. It was also around this time that he sought to create his own game that would replicate TAP's modes in order to practice at home. Aki had done a variety of software development in the past, and he had recently begun publishing his software online under the name TrioSoft, although it's unclear whether this name referred to multiple developers or just him. In connection to this publishing name, Aki began to go by the name Trio, and it was under this name that TexMaster was first released to the public in February 2003. What separated TexMaster from D-Tet and Heberus was that it was designed to be a direct copy of TAP, featuring equivalent modes to TGM1, Normal, Master, and Doubles. And it wasn't just a clone in mechanics, the visuals were designed to emulate TAP as well. The game also used sound effects ripped straight from TAP, although how these sounds were acquired in the first place is unclear. Not long after the initial release of TexMaster, Trio began work on a professional version, containing Death Mode and replicas of Flashpoint and Block Seed. But this version wasn't available to the public. The only way to get it was to contact Trio and pay him for it. Most of the community agreed. This was a step too far. Trio was now selling a clone. Mihara was understandably displeased. Wait, aren't we still in the computer? Trippy. Strangely, part of the licensing deal with TTC was that Eureka would handle any clones of the TGM series, not TTC. If they failed to prevent the proliferation of clones, they would lose their license. So, sometime in early to mid 2003, Eureka's failure to handle the clone, almost certainly referring to TexMaster, led to TGM3's hiatus. The details beyond this are fuzzy, but presumably either Eureka or the community contacted Trio and informed him that TexMaster was hurting the future of the series. The community did want TGM clones, but that was only because TAP wasn't on home consoles, and they really wanted TAP on home consoles, so they turned on Trio quick. Now, I'm not 100% sure, but it appears that Trio stopped selling TexMaster Professional not long before the Dorimaga interview went out, which is what allowed development of TGM3 to resume. The wording in the interview implies that the game was completely cancelled due to TTC, and Eureka likely had to go through the whole pitch and approval process again, hence why Mihara was still in licensing talks when the interview went out. So, Eureka's relationship with TTC was now strained, which meant Mihara wasn't planning on approaching them about the PS2 port anytime soon. All he could really do was work on TGM3 and hope that the community would be understanding and avoid distributing clones. The community understood, mostly, and things progressed quietly. Mihara even revealed the in-development PS2 port, saying he was hoping for a release around fall of 2004. Eventually, spring rolled around, but there still wasn't any news regarding TGM3 or the port. Normally, there would at least be a public playtest by this point, but Eureka may just have been behind schedule due to the licensing issues, so as long as nothing gets in the way... Oh. It appears Trio didn't get the memo. By April, he had re-released TexMaster on a new website, complete with all the features that were originally part of the paid version, and it still contained TAP's sound effects. In an attempt to resolve the issue peacefully with both Trio and the fuming community, Mihara made a public announcement on his blog stating that while he appreciated the passion behind TexMaster, clones of TGM, even free ones, would hurt the series. Like with GTET, Mihara was hoping that Trio would be understanding and take the game down. Instead, Trio completely ignored him and continued working. Once the community realized what had happened, they decided to contact Trio themselves, explaining the situation and asking him to take down the game. Trio responded stating he didn't know anything about Mihara's blog, and that since he hadn't been contacted directly asking him to take down TexMaster, he saw no issue. This is, of course, the most poor attempt at feigning ignorance ever attempted by a human being. Trio had been reading the 2chan threads he 100% knew. He was very clearly taking advantage of Mihara's leniency and good faith in order to continue working on TexMaster, which is certainly not the outcome Mihara was expecting. So he decided to contact Trio directly and put an end to this once and for all. However, by this point Trio's email address no longer worked, and there was no point sending him a message on the anonymous forum. Mihara was at a loss for what to do. Eureka could take Trio to court, and they would likely win, but doing so would personally and financially ruin a poor university student. Worse, if Trio had a job, a lawsuit would also likely get him fired and ruin his career. But on the other hand, Eureka's relationship with TTC was already precarious. If another incident happened, they wouldn't get another chance at a Tetris license for years, if ever. So Mihara simply continued to express his concern through his blog. This, in turn, caused a build-up of frustration in the community, who began to further insult Trio, who only grew more defiant and arrogant in turn. Trio claimed this was actually the community's fault for being too indiscreet with TexMaster and making a public fuss, and soon he was blaming Mihara and Erika for their inability to negotiate with TTC. He was just generally shifting blame to anyone but himself. Mihara, afraid of saying anything that might offend TTC, but also afraid to ruin a man's life over this, had no other option but to continue politely stressing the importance of ending distribution of TexMaster, while at the same time pleading with the community to remain respectful regarding the situation. The community, furious at Trio's continued arrogance, largely ignored these pleas and continued hurling insults. Trio posted more provocative remarks. Mihara pleaded again for him to take down his game. The community hurled more insults and blamed Mihara for not being aggressive enough. Trio posted more provocative remarks. Mihara pleaded again. On the 6th of May 2004, Mihara officially announced that he had no choice but to report TexMaster to TTC. He explained that as the one responsible for policing clones, admitting his failure would almost certainly lead to Erika losing the license for TGM3, as well as losing any chance of obtaining a license for the PS2 port. He estimated that Erika would have to wait at least another 2 years before they would get a shot at any kind of Tetris license, and if they did, it would be without him. Because of the damage this drama had done to Erika's reputation and their relationship with TTC, Mihara was making plans to resign as vice president, after finishing the work he was doing on some of Erika's other games. Finally, he would be shutting down his blog, a complete admission of defeat. After nearly 6 years of trying, Erika had failed to release a TGM game outside of arcades. Mihara was completely, utterly miserable. Back in the late 90s and even the early 2000s, there were actually quite a few people who didn't like Mihara very much. He was commonly described as short-tempered, vindictive, and generally too immature to be a vice president. I suppose those people were getting what they wanted. However, the situation didn't quite go how Mihara was expecting. Not long after this announcement, Trio did finally take down TexMaster. His claimed reason was that enough people had the game that he no longer needed to provide a download link, and he proudly boasted that he would begin work on a new version soon, but for now he was gone. In addition, TTC had indicated that they were still potentially willing to work with Erika regarding the TGM licenses, but the situation was now incredibly delicate. Realizing that he may still have a slim chance of saving the TGM series and his job, on the 8th of May, Mihara launched what he called the final gamble. This gamble turned out to be begging the community to delete any posts they had made criticizing TTC, as the company apparently had employees who could read Japanese and were watching the public forums. Mihara was pretty confident that the public's discretion regarding the situation would affect license negotiations, which was worrying considering their track record. But the community did largely respect Mihara's wishes and moderate their public posts. After 2 months of suspense, on July 12th, Mihara put out another announcement, and it was good news all around. First of all, Erika hadn't lost the TGM3 license. In fact, a location test was planned for August. The PS2 port probably wasn't happening, but another new TGM game was in development for the upcoming PlayStation Portable, and it was called TGM-K. The K apparently stands for killer, but the public didn't know that. I'm not sure why he announced this so confidently though, because yet again, Erika didn't actually have a license yet, and nearly immediately after this announcement, their bid for the PSP was denied. As it turns out, Sony decided they wanted the license, and well, it's their console. Mihara's response was, well, let's at least hope their game is fun. Sony would go on to not make a Tetris game. The only Tetris game ever released for the PSP was by EA in 2009. We do actually have an image of TGM-K, can we pull that up? Thank you, Mihara. Although outwardly happy and appreciative to TTC for the TGM3 license, it's hard to imagine Mihara was anything but miserable by this point. He had now tried and failed 4 times to release a TGM game outside of arcades, probably more that he never mentioned publicly, and all he had received was a 3rd arcade game. This game, and any future TGM game, would have to follow the Guideline, a guideline designed around a completely different Tetris philosophy. The complete lack of home console ports for a game series that does not fit the arcade style had all but ensured TGM's imminent demise at the hands of clones and emulators. You can tell Mihara's mood had shifted regarding this topic by the way he spoke about Trio, who it seemed was not going to receive any legal consequences. He was beginning to regret not suing. Also, there was now competition in the arcade market too. Success Corp had returned to ruin Mihara's day again with Tetris Kiwame Michi, another basic Tetris game that released both in arcades and for PS2. Kiwame Michi was boring, it had a few random gimmicks, it felt like a bootleg TGM game, and of course it had infinite move resets. Mihara's health, both physical and mental, had noticeably declined over the past year, due in part to TGM but also some unrelated health issues that only made things worse. But still, he pushed forward. And there were upsides. The 2 location tests in August and October went pretty well, people were hyped for TGM3, and 2005 would turn out to be a good year for the series. Not only would it be the year of TGM3, but Mihara would finally get the chance to release a game for a home console, the upcoming Xbox 360. Is the future finally looking up? Could Mihara's misfortune finally be turning around? No?